Okay, this is a recording um, of some content to accompany the Ibri text on the first three dynasties of China. We will end here on this slide with the Qin Empire, the first unified imperial bureaucratic empire, and some would say the beginning of imperial China. So prior to 221 BC or BCE, China is more a kingdom or a series of kingdoms and smaller states. And only in 221 BCE, for just 15 years until 206 BCE, um, that's when China becomes a unified empire. So we'll get here, but we'll jump back in our big slideshow, which is available to you on Canvas. And I've shared it a few times. You can download the full thing. It is over 200 slides. So there's a lot here, almost 300 actually, slides. There's a lot here for you to go through. And this is mainly just meant to help support your reading of the Ibri, give you some pictures and maybe some brief summary, big ideas to accompany the reading. I'm going to move through these slides very briefly, very briskly, and you can pause the video to take some notes. And of course, you can also go through the slideshow at your own speed because in addition to this video, I'm giving you the full slideshow to go through at your own pace. Okay, so here's the map of Imperial China. And we're going to zoom in and see that, or rather, this is a physical map of East Asia. You see Japan, the Japanese archipelago off here on the eastern side and the far right of the map. There's the Philippines. And this is the People's Republic of China today. That is a map of China today. In China, people say this looks a little bit like a rooster in profile, maybe. And the two major islands, Taiwan and Hainan here, which is not labeled, this is the region that I study actually, look sort of like the rooster's claws, maybe the rooster's feet. And so this sort of shape of a rooster here with this coxcomb over the top and its tail feathers here, Tibetan Xinjiang, and its heartland is sort of here on the east coast. This is the current map of China, but it hasn't always looked that way. And actually, it wasn't really until the Mongol and Manchu dynasties conquered China that it took on that shape. But we'll talk a little bit more about this. Here are a couple major rivers of China. We've now zoomed in on this map, you'll see. We zoom in here, we see the Yellow River here in the north. And this is the cradle of Chinese civilization. And the Yangtze River here, which divides North and South China. And earliest Chinese history, as it is defined by most Chinese historians these days, is up here in the Yellow River Valley area. That's the beginnings of Chinese civilization. Quick word on the Chinese language. This is Mandarin Pinyin or Putonghua Pinyin romanization. These are some unfamiliar letters. I just want to give you, if you're anything like me, you like to be able to pronounce things as you read them. And here are a few unfamiliar uses of our Roman alphabet. That is to make the Q a CH, as in Qin, first dynasty, first unified imperial bureaucratic dynasty of China. The Xia, that X, also you'll see that in the news, of course, because the current leader of People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping, starts his surname, his last name, his family name, Xi, with an X, and that's like an SH sound. And then the C, Cao, that is like a TS, as an unusual pronunciation of the C. The Z is like a DS or a Zuo, and the ZH here is Zhang. The four tones of Chinese, you don't need to know these, but in case you're interested, ma, 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 ma. First tone is ma, second tone is ma, third tone is ma, fourth tone is ma. These are the four tones in Mandarin or Putonghua, which is the northern dialect, standard dialect of Chinese today. But if you combine a few simple terms, you can get most of the names of Chinese regions. He, Hu, Hai, Shan, Guang, river, lake, sea, mountain, broad, and then, of course, your directionals, Dong, Nan, Xi, Bei, Dong, east, Nan, south, Xi, west, Bei, north. When you combine them, you'll see on this slide, which I'm going to move through quickly, but Hebei means to the north of the river. That's this province here. Henan, south of the river. Shanxi, Shandong, west and east of the mountain, respectively. the river here they're referring to as the Yellow River, and the mountain they're referring to is Taishan Mountain. Hubei, Dongting Lake is down here. There's not much of it left, but when there was a lake there, they named these regions north of the lake and south of the lake Hubei and Hunan. And then southern broad region or southern expanse, Guangxi and Guangdong, the broad west and the broad east. It's referring to the southern plains here. And then Hainan, for bonus points here, Hainan is to the south of the sea. Okay. This slide show this quick timeline may be useful if you want to just take a look at this. You can print this out, of course. Shang Zhou. This is the ancient period, sometimes called the Bronze Age dynasties, the Qin and the Han in the period of disunity. Now, I should have put that in quotes, period of disunity, because when I use that phrase, it assumes that unity of this region is somehow a default or factory settings. And I would actually take issue with that. So, as they say, put 3 historians in a room and you'll get 5 different opinions. I sort of disagree with my own choice here, not to put period of disunity in quotation marks, because I think there is a judgment in calling this a period of disunity. It assumes that unity is the status quo or is some kind of stasis in Chinese politics, and I don't think that's the case. The brief sway, and then the Tang Song, then the Mongol Yuan dynasty, and then the Ming and the Manchu Qing dynasty. So these are the major dynasties. And if you look in this period in the 3rd to 6th centuries, you'll find that there are lots of shorter dynasties. In the Zhou, there are a lot of other kingdoms. So this is just a sort of sketch. Now, when we zoom in just a little bit here, we see the Shang and then the Zhou period. The Zhou gets divided into the Western and Eastern Zhou. And the Eastern Zhou in turn gets divided into the spring and autumn period and the Warring States period. And I've given you the dates for all of these. I'm not going to ask you to memorize these dates. I don't think that's necessarily a productive way to approach this material, but you should have a basic idea of what we're talking about here, that we're going back to 2100 BCE for the Xia, and then the Shang starts around 1600 BCE or BC. That's when we start to have a written record, and we definitely have some archaeological proof of the existence of the Shang, whereas we mainly rely on later histories and mythologies even to talk about the Xia dynasty. And we find in those mythologies references to magic and that kind of thing, a little bit like the Greek histories of Achilles and Ulysses and that kind of thing, which are mixes of magic and maybe probably some history mixed in there, but we don't really have too much to go by in the history of the Xia. So again, there's our physical map of China. You should spend a little bit of time with that, see how it fits into the South Asian, Southeast Asian, and then North Asia here as well, how that all sort of fits together. Okay, ancient China. Now we zoom in here on this specific period, the Xia, Shang, and Zhou. These are sometimes called the Bronze Age dynasties. And we see that indeed the Zhou is where things really get cooking in terms of history, and we have a lot more to work with. The Xia, as I said, is largely based on mythology. We don't have a lot of artifacts, and we don't have any documents based on this, but it's mainly based on the history of Sima Qian, who is a Han Dynasty historian we'll talk about in just a little bit. And a lot of Sima Qian's histories about the Shang have been vindicated by archaeology. And he also talks a little bit about the Xia. And based on his work there, I think we can assume that some aspects of what he said about the Xia are probably accurate. But there are some magical aspects here, mythical kings and that kind of thing, and sort of divine intervention in terms of bequeathing skills to worthy people, like the gods sort of teaching or giving humans things like fire and agricultural abilities and tools and that kind of thing. And so there's this interplay between the human and the divine worlds here, sort of Promethean figures, as in the Greek context. Sericulture is very important. Of course, writing is very important, agriculture. These are all very important to Chinese culture. One other thing I want to note here is also the tamer of floods. this is a way for rulers to gain legitimacy, to say that they were the ones who tamed the Yellow River, because the Yellow River is so important in Chinese history. It also is prone to flooding. That's why it's called yellow. It's filled with silt, and a river that gets filled with silt becomes prone to flooding, because as it deposits that silt, the riverbed rises. So as the river slows, the silt is deposited. And as the silt or the sand is deposited on the riverbed rises. And if the riverbed rises too high, then it's the same height as the riverbank. And of course, the water goes everywhere and floods. So that becomes very common, especially in the example of the Yellow River. So the tamers of the floods were the early kings. They were not necessarily magic. They certainly weren't magic, but they were using their knowledge of the rivers to demonstrate their legitimacy and their ability to manage the floods through waterworks, through dredging the riverbed and building up dikes around the river in order to manage it. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the mandate of heaven. Now, the Shang is the first dynasty that we have written records about. We have the oracle bones, talk about them in just a second, and we have bronzes. So those are the main, with bronze ritual vessels and bronze weapons. That's the beginning. Now, just take a quick look at the Shang dynasty geographical expanse. That is the outermost reaches of the Shang dynasty. So this early Chinese dynasty obviously is it looks like to me about a tenth the size of the People's Republic of China today. So in the same way that we think about American history, we think about the 13 colonies, or we think just about Plymouth Rock or something like that. I think it's a value judgment. It's a decision that we make to see the United States spreading in the way that it does, and to tell a kind of teleological history that says this was the sort of acorn that grew into the great oak. Well, of course, an acorn doesn't grow into an oak without soil and water and sunshine and a lack of chainsaws, right? An acorn is not the oak tree. An acorn is the seed of the oak. In the same way that when we think about the Shang dynasty, it's only a value judgment of the historian to say that that's the beginning of Chinese history, and we need to be really precise about what we mean by that in an upper division history class. Well, we're talking about the Chinese language. Okay, if that's really the most important thing, then you need to be precise about that, because the other assumed through line of Chinese history from this very early period is a subjective judgment of the scholar. I want to be very clear about that. So we call the Shang dynasty, this class is called Chinese history, the Shang is called Chinese history, but let's be mindful of how we throw that term around. Okay, here are the bronzes. The bronzes are important for a number of reasons. I'm going to move very quickly here. They're important for ritual and weaponry. They also show the ability to mobilize very large portions of the population to extract the copper, tin from mountains, and then the craftsmanship to actually make it look this way, to melt it into these forms. And then the other really important thing here is the oracle bones. Now, there's a lot to know about the oracle bones here, but you can see the OBI, or oracle bone inscription graph, on the left, and you can see how it gets connected to the modern character. And I've given you the pinyin here as well. This is the plastron, not the shell of a tortoise, if we're being very precise here. It's the belly, the soft belly, not the shell of the tortoise. Some people call the oracle bones turtle shells. They're actually the bellies, the plastrons. And these ones down in the lower right here are cattle scapula, or cattle collarbones, because they offer a very large flat surface on which to write. And this was the practice of pyromancy, in which ritual experts would carve characters, early sort of proto-Chinese characters, on these things, and then either stick a hot poker against the thing or put it actually into the fire, and cracks would then emerge around or through the characters, and the shaman, the ritual expert, would make some kind of divination based on this. And so that was called pyromancy, or divination by fire. The most important thing here is that this is the earliest form of Chinese writing. Okay, here's China proper. Just to give you a quick sketch of this. We can talk about that a little bit more later. Okay, mandate of heaven. This is a really important idea that the Shang dynasty bequeaths to us, the dynastic cycle. The mandate of heaven is the sort of will of heaven, And the implication is that evil rulers will be deposed and just and benevolent rulers will hold power. This is the way that the Zhou also legitimizes its conquest of the Shang. And I think it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's kind of retroactive history or teleology to say that evil rulers are knocked out in history and good rulers sustain their positions. Of course, that's a nice sort of Disney fairy tale. It sounds good. Of course, it's not true. If you study history, I think you're hard pressed to actually sustain that kind of magical thinking. But it is a celebration of ritual and of perceived benevolence or goodness, and of hierarchy. People should stay in their place as long as there's some kind of order. It's an emphasis on sort of law and order kind of society as well. It offers some potential for meritocracy and mobility. But the idea here is this sort of retroactive or teleological, telos, the Greek from end, the Greek word for end, or telling history from the end, as a means of sort of imposing a kind of retroactive logic on it. That's what the mandate of heaven is. And again, just like calling this Chinese history, to refer to whoever wins a civil war as sort of the will of heaven, is a kind of strong belief in the idea of predetermination or fate or will. And I personally think that's a bit of magical thinking if we get into sort of historical realities here. But it was a very effective way of people in this time to legitimate their own leadership, their own rule. Okay, so that's an important legacy of the Zhou, and it's going to continue for a long time after that, the mandate of heaven. And the dynastic cycle, which implied that the beginning of a dynasty was a virtuous period in which this obviously deserving group of people, or maybe rebels, or maybe rival aristocrats, were able to seize power and hold power because they were benevolent, and then they fell, and maybe morally they declined, and maybe they were they became decadent, and they became too preoccupied with the harem and the brothels and feasting and excess and gluttony and that kind of thing. And therefore, another great rebel came, and a very virtuous, brave rebel comes riding in, sort of white knight, and deposes this dynasty. And of course, you sort of see where we're going with that in terms of the kind of fairy tale element. Okay, so we have the Western Zhou and the Eastern Zhou. As we mentioned before, looking at the timeline. And we see especially in the Eastern Zhou, the so-called 100 schools of thought begin to emerge. We'll talk about each one of them very briefly today: Confucianism, legalism, Taoism, Moism. The Duke of Zhou is very important. He's a kind of proto-Confucian here. I'm not going to go through this whole thing here, but he's around at the beginning of the Zhou. He's very important because he's very filial, he's dutiful, he's good to his elder brother, who had been the king and died, and therefore the Duke of Zhou's nephew was next in line for the throne. We know how these things go, whether you're reading the Bible or Shakespeare or whatever. The sort of greedy uncle knocks off his nephew and takes the throne. But that's not what happens here. The Duke of Zhou is very dutiful and filial and ritually correct according to his obligation. And he serves as regent until his nephew is no longer a minor. He achieves his majority and becomes the new king of the Zhou. There aren't many examples of this, sort of like George Washington decisively saying that he didn't want to become king or didn't want to serve beyond his first 2 terms. Cincinnatus and Rome, that kind of thing, laying down his sword. These sort of things don't happen very often. And so Confucius later is going to be looking back to this 500 years later as his great example of filial and ritual virtue. Okay, some of the Zhou legacies, rituals, the profound importance of ritual, ancestral spirits, or filial piety. We're going to talk a little bit more about this. The mandate of heaven, the sort of double-edged sword of legitimacy, and the philosophers. We're going to talk about those guys all right now. So here, this is going to be early imperial China. We'll get here in just a minute. But before we do, the so-called 100 schools of thought. Here they are, or here are a few of the major ones anyway. This isn't everybody, but this is most of what we're going to talk about now. The Confucian canon emerges before Confucius. And that's a point he really wanted to emphasize. He said, look, I'm not making this stuff up. I'm going to base my ideas on these classical texts that come from the period that predates me, going especially back to the period of the Duke of Zhou, 500 years before Confucius. The Duke of Zhou is around about 1000 BCE. Confucius is around about 500 BCE. And he gestures back to the Confucian classics, and you should have some familiarity with what these are, because you see here an emphasis on history, literary refinement, and a ritual. The Book of Changes is a book of ritual divination. And of course, the Rites is a book of rituals as well. Spring and Autumn Annals, the one that maybe Confucius had a hand in writing himself, is also another history book. So history, literary refinement, a ritual, those are the values here. Okay, quick word on legalism. Here are the major figures in legalism. Again, you can pause the video at any point and take your time with it. Qin Shi Huangdi is the first emperor of China, so we're gonna get there. But before we do, we need to know what the lay of the land is before then. Legalism is the school of thought that believes that human nature is evil. Write down the laws, or people are going to go out and mug their grandmother on her way home from work. This idea is that human nature is evil, and the only way that people are kept in check is through excessively harsh punishments. So I'm going to move quickly through this. This idea is very, very important because it's going to define the first unified empire of China. But before it does, we also have this figure of Confucius to talk a little bit about. So we'll come back to this in just a bit when we talk about the Qin and the Han, and I'll come back to these slides. But here's just a word about the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang. We'll get here in just a second. These are some of the key things that defined the Qin dynasty. Again, you can take your time and pause the video and take a look at these notes. You'll understand what's going on here. This, of course, is the Terracotta Warriors and the Great Wall, which begins construction in this period, but doesn't really finish. The legacy of the Qin, and here are a few of the big legacies bolded here: standardization, mass mobilization, legalism, of course, and the infrastructure. The brief Qin dynasty leaves all of these legacies. It also leaves a legacy of contesting with the Xiongnu, who are the proto-Mongols. These are the ancestors of the Mongols to the north of China. And they are dealt with through these sort of three main modes of either diplomacy or conflict. So we'll talk about them a little bit more in our next video. This is the Qin and the Han. This is just a quick reminder that we're not talking about the entire map of China, of course. But we'll get back to this in just a minute. I want to quickly talk about our friend here, Confucius, Kongzi, Kongfuzi. Kongxiu was his birth name. Note the birth and death dates. I'm not going to ask you to memorize these, but I want you to know that this is when Confucius is around, roughly around the 6th century BCE, same time as Siddhartha Gautama, who's going to become the Buddha, roughly the same time. We'll talk about him in our next lesson as well. Okay, Confucius and Confucianism. Remember, he says he's a transmitter. He says, I'm not making this stuff up. I'm not an innovator. I'm just interpreting what I consider to be the great culture of the earlier Zhou period. The values that he's talking about are filial piety, that is, the reverence of children for their parents, sons for their fathers. There's a strong patriarchal aspect to it, male superiority here, and elder superiority. Benevolence or goodness. That means that if a son is appropriately dutiful, then the father is expected to be benevolent in turn, right? So a good, dutiful son may have a cruel, wicked father, and that father is failing in his Confucian obligation to be magnificent, to be generous, and benevolent. Hierarchy, again, knowing one's place, and then ritual, and all these things really hang together. Also an importance of history. Okay, so we see the state as a macrocosm of the microcosmic family. The Analects were compiled later. They're not written by Confucius. I already told you about the Confucian canon here. This is just a reminder that it predates Confucian, and he's sort of the interpreter of these ideas. This is a quick comparison between Confucianism and legalism that you can take a look at yourself. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I want to try to keep this video short, but you can pause it and take your time here. Mozi and Moism. This is another interesting school of thought. It does not become predominant here in this time period. It does not become the main school of thought or the dominant school of thought. But it is important in its own time. So I want you to take a look here. A reminder, this just follows on the Ibri text. Comes from a poor background. He believed that partiality or having a preference for things is the cause of strife. And filial piety, having a preference for one's own family, is a problem to Mozi, which is quite remarkable. He believes that universal love, not in the sort of hippy-dippy way, but in the sense of equal love. You should love your neighbor's family as you love your own. You should love the family and the humanity of people on the other side of the planet as much as you love your own parents or children. This is a strikingly radical idea, even considered, I would say, radical 2,500 years after Mozi's own time. I think this is a bridge too far for most of us to value people on the other side of the planet as much as you value your own humanity. But I would say it is a hell of a good idea in terms of ending wars and ending greed and ending conflicts. But of course, it is a radical and very, very challenging idea. Okay, now that's Moism. Taoism, Laozi and Zhuangzi are the two main Taoist thinkers. Laozi around the same time as Confucius. Follow nature, follow the way of nature, which is mysterious, but we seek to be in harmony or unison with it. Ambition and greed are the source of human grief. Allow the way to prevail in the state. That's the only way to rule truly powerfully. Scholarly debate, overthinking things, reading too many books will not solve the problems, according to the Taoists. Very, very different from the Confucians who say, read your history, learn your history. History is good, learn it, read it for examples. The Taoists are exactly the opposite in terms of saying, yes, sure, maybe it's good to be wise, but that's not where you're going to find the answers to, life's persistent questions. They challenge rituals, just like the Moists. They also challenge rituals of the past, and the legalists are going to do that as well. The legalists also challenge these rituals of the past. Zhuangzi is following on Laozi, is the great Taoist, the second great Taoist thinker. He debated with Confucians actively. He would tease them, and in his own text, the Zhuangzi, he teases them. Like Laozi, he says there is a way, we can't describe it, but I think we still aspire to follow it. And I'll talk a little bit more about Taoism, Laozi, and Zhuangzi in the next lesson. And then that brings us to the First Empire of China, which I will start with when we resume in our next video. But this was a sort of light speed, very, very quick run through Chinese philosophy. You'll also get it in your reading of the Ibri. I hope this helps as a very, very hasty, quick run through Chinese history. As always, you can find me in my office hours. You can email me any questions. Okay, I'll see you in the next video.